Hey guys, tonight we're headed somewhere exceptionally slow, delightfully odd, and entirely unsupervised by common sense. Picture this, a velvet-lined racetrack, teacups rattling gently on a tray, polite applause from a crowd in gloves and monocles, and dead center, a tortoise inching toward a strawberry. Yes, you're at a tortoise race in Victorian England. Welcome, you crouch low in the garden shade, watching as a bespectacled judge in a waistcoat adjusts a miniature flag at the finish line. Somewhere behind you, a piano plinks out a polite waltz. The air smells like lavender, clotted cream, and distant horse manure. You're about to witness the slowest competition known to polite society. And odds are, you probably wouldn't survive this not because it's dangerous, but because your modern brain just doesn't have the patience. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is over there now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin not in the manicured gardens of a country estate, but at a cozy, over-decorated drawing room in 1850s Bath. Lace curtains, floral wallpaper, a particularly judgmental-looking cat. At the center of the room is a square of green velvet cloth placed carefully over the Persian carpet for ladies in buttoned boots, and one anxious butler kneel beside it. Each holds a tortoise. The cloth square isn't just for decor, it's a racetrack, about 2 feet across. A silver thimble marks the finish line. The butler coughs nervously. "Madame, shall I commence the race?" You watch as the tortoises are placed gently at the starting line, a single white thread marking the edge. On cue, someone produces a lettuce leaf. The tension is exquisite. This, dear listener, is how the tortoise racing craze quietly crawled its way into British life. It began not with official rules or governing bodies, but with the sorts of parlor amusements that filled the days of the wealthy when croquet felt too energetic and embroidery too repetitive. Tortoises were already considered novelty pets. By the early 1800s, imported curiosities from warmer climates, usually Mediterranean or North African, they were cheap, hardy, and most importantly, dull enough to be amusing. Unlike a parrot, they wouldn't insult your guests. Unlike a dog, they didn't ruin the rug. And unlike a cat, they didn't judge you out loud. But eventually, someone, somewhere must have had the thought, what if we raced them? We don't know who this was. Historians still argue whether it began among idle aristocrats, bored schoolboys, or eccentric botanists who liked to test tortoise speed in garden experiments. What we do know is that by the 1840s, mentions of tortoise contests began appearing in scattered personal diaries and letters. No official rules, no medals, just slow-motion showdowns in drawing rooms, hallways, and garden walks. Of course, no tortoise has ever sprinted anywhere. Even the most athletic of them top out at a thrilling 0.3 miles per hour. But Victorians weren't after adrenaline, they were after charm. Watching a tortoise race was about absurd anticipation, polite cheering, and the hope that your slow friend would move just slightly faster than the others. Imagine the commentary. "Oh look, Arthur's given up entirely. Daisy appears to be asleep on the starting line. Sebastian is ... Oh, he's changed direction again." These were the headlines of the day, if only inside one's own home. Some races were conducted in straight lines, others in circles. Occasionally, barriers were added, tiny hill of soil, a hoop made from knitting needles, the ever-dreaded handkerchief trap. Spectators would sip tea, place small wagers usually in biscuits or buttons, and pretend to care deeply. Tortoises, of course, noticed none of this. Now, not all Victorians approved. One particularly sharp-tongued cleric referred to such races as an utter misuse of God's reptiles. Others feared the activity was unladylike, especially when women became competitive. Still, the trend slithered onward by the 1850s. If you were wealthy and owned a tortoise, it was almost expected that you'd raced it at least once. There were even debates about how best to motivate one's tortoise. Some swore by cabbage leaves, others used strawberries. One eccentric soul reportedly used the scent of cut cucumber as a lure, claiming his tortoise responded with unusual enthusiasm. Historians still argue whether this was genuine strategy or Victorian sarcasm. And it wasn't just the racing that intrigued people. Lit was the entire setup. Tracks were lovingly crafted from crushed velvet, felt, or even chalked patterns on the stone floor. Some had numbered lanes. Some included decorative flags made from toothpicks and ribbon. One particularly artistic gentleman carved a tiny grandstand for his other pets to watch from, including a mildly confused hedgehog. And then there were the names. You never just had a pet tortoise named Tortoise. No, you had Sir Clive of Cheltenham, or Her Majesty's slowest servant, or Reggie the Reluctant. Some Victorians took it even further, commissioning tiny hats for their shelled athletes. These were usually made from scrap fabric, a thimble, or in one infamous case, a discarded coin purse. Why? Because the only thing funnier than watching a tortoise race is watching a tortoise race while wearing formal headwear. All this is not to say that everyone adored the practice. Critics called it pointless, undignified, even cruel in its triviality. But supporters insisted it was harmless and wholesome, and frankly, there were few better ways to spend a rainy Tuesday in Wiltshire. It's easy now to laugh at this, to imagine a parlour full of serious-faced Victorians waiting breathlessly as a tortoise inches half a foot forward. But that was precisely the point. It was the waiting that made it worthwhile. The pause, the collective hush, the absurdity of hope pinned on a creature that could, and often did, fall asleep mid-race. You lie back, the hum of a fan in your ear, and picture it. The slow scrape of shell on floorboard, the polite clink of teacups, the rising tension as one tortoise overtakes another by an entire inch dot. No shouts, no clock, just a timeless competition in velvet and silence. You blink slowly as the gentle scraping sound of a tortoise's claws fades into the hush of a drawing room. The race has ended, though you're not entirely sure when, and the victor is being celebrated with a polite round of clapping and a tiny flower pinned to its shell. No one seems to mind that it took nearly half an hour. Now, step outside with your tea, into the garden. You're in Surrey, it's June, and you're attending what is quaintly called a shell soirée. Don't let the name fool you. This is, in fact, a full-on tortoise racing party, complete with guests in lawn dresses, parasols tilted just so, and a faint waft of cucumber sandwiches in the air. A string quartet plays softly from the gazebo, and on the far end of the lawn is the main attraction. A rectangular racetrack bordered by garden twine and dotted with colourful markers. Ladies in bonneted hats and gents in cravats mill about, inspecting the racers, murmuring their odds, and sipping from delicate porcelain cups. Several tortoises lounge in wicker baskets, their shells glinting slightly in the sunlight, each wearing a small paper number affixed with a tiny dot of wax dot. This is not a game for the underdressed or the underprepared. You crouch beside one, particularly enthusiastic participant, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Penelope Brighton, who is adjusting a satin bow tied loosely around her champion's midsection. His name is Wellington, she informs you, with the gravity of someone introducing a prime minister. He enjoys dandelions, avoids moist soil, and has an excellent turning radius. She gestures toward the track. Watch the inside lane. That's where the clover is. Gives him motivation. You nod, not entirely sure how to respond. This, you realize, is how Victorian society gradually turned tortoise racing from a quirky parlor game into a full-fledged leisure activity. It had rules now unwritten perhaps, but rules nonetheless. There were expectations, etiquette, a dress code. The racetracks got fancier, the tortoises got accessories, and wages became more than buttons. Coins were placed discreetly into handkerchiefs and slipped across teac ups. It wasn't about winning, of course. It was about being seen, attending. Like pheasant shooting or the theatre, tortoise racing became a curious badge of upper-class leisure. One didn't just own a tortoise. One cultivated it. Still, it wasn't without its tensions. Competition, no matter how slow, brings out peculiar passions. Take, for instance, the infamous incident at Lady Cotteridge's Summer Lawn Fete of 1861. Two racers, Beauregard and Myrtle, had tied at the halfway mark. The judges were baffled. A debate ensued over whether Myrtle's foot had technically passed the chalk line before Beauregard's beak did. The argument lasted longer than the race itself. One onlooker reportedly fainted. Historians still argue whether this was due to the heat or the absurdity of the situation. From such silliness, a peculiar sort of prestige emerged. To have the fastest tortoise was to command attention at every event. Children began naming their pets after generals, poets, and even Shakespearean characters. Families would carve initials into the shells, not recommended, by the way though, common then, or paint colorful designs using enamel polish. And yes, there were accessories. Ribbons were most common. But one particularly fashionable trend in 1865 was to commission a custom saddle-shaped shell cover, embroidered with your family's crest. Think heraldic embroidery meets reptilian couture. But what made it more than just a pastime was its accessibility. Unlike fox hunting or fencing, you didn't need a massive estate or a personal trainer. You just needed a patch of lawn, a mildly hungry tortoise, and a willingness to wait. For the ladies of the house, especially, this became a cherished outlet. Social norms discouraged overt athleticism or rough sport, but guiding a tortoise with a dandelion stalk, entirely acceptable, even encouraged. And so, afternoon after afternoon, garden parties across the country unfolded in the same slow, sleepy rhythm. Tortoises would be paraded, bets made, gentle arguments raised, and cucumber sandwiches consumed. Occasionally, a tortoise would stubbornly turn around halfway down the track and return to its basket. When this happened, no one scolded. They applauded its strong will. By the late 1860s, manuals on animal care began referencing tortoise racing as a healthy and enriching diversion, offering tips like, never race a cold tortoise, or avoid sharp gravel. It impedes morale. Whether these tips were based in science or in pure anthropomorphism is unclear. Historians still debate whether Victorian pet owners truly understood reptile biology or simply made things up with great confidence. And amid all of this, amid the tiny trophies, the journal entries, the gossip over lemon cakes, there was a deeply human need to connect with something small, strange, and slow-moving. Life in Victorian England, especially for the well-to-do, could be structured to the point of sterility. Tortoise racing offered a rare break in rhythm, an absurdity that slowed time even further, a ritual where progress was measured not in paces or speed, but in whether a shell moved at all. You sip your imaginary tea, feel the warmth of the garden sun, and lean into the moment. The race begins again. A bell rings softly. The tortoises emerge from their baskets. One starts, pauses, sniffs a rose petal, then continues. No one minds. They're here for the journey, not the destination. The summer days of the 1860s drift on like the contestants of a particularly lazy heat. You find yourself quite used to the rhythm, now the rustle of skirts over freshly trimmed hedges, the clink of teaspoons against porcelain, and somewhere, in the distance, the faint thud of another tortoise nudging against the garden wall. Today, though, the stakes are higher. You've been invited to a private demonstration in the conservatory of Sir Horace Llewellyn, a retired naval captain turned exotic animal enthusiast. He has, in his words, revolutionized the sport, which is, of course, an utterly hilarious thing to say about tortoises. You're ushered in past fern-laden hallways and displays of dried sea sponges until you reach the grand glass dome of the conservatory. Inside, a tortoise track like no other, sloped lanes, miniature hedgerows, even a tiny arched bridge made of shellacked twigs, Sir Horace beams. Modelled after the terrain of the Galapagos, he explains proudly, adds challenge, builds character. The tortoises, you notice, do not appear to be building character so much as napping under a patch of dappled sunlight. Still, you admire the effort, because this is part of what made tortoise racing so delightfully absurd and yet, somehow, enduring, the sheer commitment to the bit. People poured time, money, and often a baffling amount of engineering prowess into improving a sport that was fundamentally a waiting game. Sir Horace, for instance, maintained meticulous breeding logs. He cross-referenced shell width with glide potential. He claimed without irony that certain shell patterns improved aerodynamics. Historians still argue whether he was joking or had simply been left alone for too long with too many tortoises. But he wasn't the only one who took things seriously. By 1870, amateur shell clubs began forming in the parlors and smoking rooms of middle-class towns. Some met weekly, others hosted quarterly tournaments. The most elite even published newsletters printed on heavy cream paper and embossed with tortoise insignia. They shared performance tips, feed cabbage the night before, commemorated notable victories, Marguerite wins by a shell's length in Ipswich, and offered classifieds for trading tortoises. A surprising number of people owned multiple racers. One such enthusiast, Miss Georgina Phipps of Bath, was rumoured to maintain a rotational shell calendar, only racing each tortoise once every 12 days to prevent fatigue. Her prize tortoise, Algernon, reportedly held a record time of 12 minutes over 4 feet of manicured lawn. A blur, one guest described, like watching a leaf move against the wind. Algernon had his own silk-lined travel box. Of course, not everyone approved. The Illustrated London News published a short editorial in 1871 titled, "The Languor of the Garden. Are we encouraging laziness?" It gently mocked the pastime as a symbol of declining British vigour. But even within its critique, there was a note of admiration. "There is something so very English," it wrote, "about turning idleness into ceremony." Indeed, that may be the most fitting description of tortoise racing in the Victorian age. Back in the conservatory, Sir Horace calls for silence. His assistant, a boy in a too large waistcoat, gently places two racers on the starting line. Their names? Admiral, Brisk and Lady Swivels. A name like Brisk is optimistic. You think, you lean forward. And they're off, by which we mean they've remained perfectly still. But the stopwatch has begun. The crowd murmurs approvingly. A woman waves a sprig of mint hopefully. Someone suggests humming softly. It might encourage movement. It takes 12 minutes for Admiral Brisk to move a single inch. But oh, what a triumphant inch it is. You'd be forgiven for thinking all of this was merely a game of the idle rich. But the appeal of tortoise racing trickled downward. As word spread through newspapers, through garden gossip and domestic servants who watched the races from the edges, even working-class communities began to adopt their own version. In pub courtyards and alleyways, you could find impromptu races with chalk-drawn lines and crusts of bread as lures. The rules were looser, the jokes cruder, but the spirit was the same, a sleepy kind of spectacle, fueled by laughter and low expectations. One tavern in Liverpool, the Pig and Ladle, hosted Shell Sundays where regulars brought their own tortoises, and the winning reptile received a whole tomato while its owner got a free pint. These races were rowdier, yes, but no less sincere. A bored factory worker's tortoise was just as likely to win as a nobleman's tortoise racing was. In its odd little way, a rare democratic sport in an undemocratic world, and still, despite the growing popularity, debates continued. Could you touch your tortoise? What counted as a step? Did a sneeze near the finish line constitute interference? Historians still argue whether there was ever an agreed-upon standard track length or whether the ambiguity was the point. But you're here for the atmosphere. You settle into a wicker chair as the tortoises round the final bend. If one can call a gentle leftward meander a bend, the music plays. The garden smells faintly of moss and crushed thyme. Somewhere a child claps in slow motion. Admiral Brisk crosses the finish line at last, cheered like a marathon champion. You smile. Because in this strange, slow, utterly unnecessary pastime, you've found something rare, a kind of peace that only exists when the world decides not to rush. You wake not with a jolt, but in the dreamlike awareness of having never truly left, as Section 4 glides forward without ceremony. The sun is now lower in the sky, casting long warm beams across cobblestone mews and rustling privet hedges. The tortoise races are winding down for the day, and yet, in many ways, this is when the real sport begins, because what is a race without gossip? And in Victorian England, gossip is both pastime and power. You find yourself reclining on a soft bench beside Mrs. Pritchard, a widow of indeterminate age, with a fondness for tea laced with sherry and stories laced with exaggeration. Her tortoise, Lord Bumble, is currently sleeping on her lap, shell freshly waxed and gleaming like a dinner plate. Did you hear, she says, lowering her voice, about the incident in Surrey? A racer disqualified for using ... mustard powder. You raise an eyebrow. Yes, darling. Sprinkled it right on the path behind the others. Encouraged Bumble to move faster. They said it was unsporting. You try not to laugh. You fail. These were the scandals of the tortoise racing world, mild, aromatic, and wholly befitting the genteel pace of the sport. But beneath the soft cushion of garden chit-chat, deeper currents stirred. Some families were building reputations around their tortoises. Not unlike prized hounds or racehorses, these creatures began to carry names that, in certain circles, demanded hushed reverence. The Everfords of Kent, for example, had an entire lineage of racers, each named Reginald. each numbered. Like Monarch's Reginald III was particularly famous for once completing a full circuit in under 7 minutes. The newspapers called it the dash in the daisies. You picture it now, a tortoise with a racing bib, tiny top hat perhaps, shell gleaming, determinedly plodding over garden pebbles, while genteel ladies gasp and fan themselves. By the early 1870s, some households went as far as hiring private shell tutors, young naturalists, and idle cousins, tasked with coaxing more speed from their shelled companions. There were whispered tales of experimental diets, tortoise massage techniques, and one especially dubious claim involving hypnosis and a metronome. Historians still argue whether Lord Winthrop actually hired a mesmerist or simply drank too much brandy before a particularly slow heat. But even more fascinating than the amateur drama were the emerging strategies of race design. You're invited next to observe a shell labyrinth, popular among racing enthusiasts who wanted more than just speed. These were carefully designed hedge mazes scaled for tortoise use, where owners claimed intelligence played a role guiding their racers with soft bells or color-coded flags. The results? Inconclusive, of course. But that hardly mattered. The joy wasn't in winning, it was in watching. And you watch now. From the edge of a croquet lawn that's been temporarily converted into a racing arena, there's a gentle cheer from the gathered crowd as a particularly chubby tortoise named Maud nudges past a painted rock. Someone passes around elderflower cordial. A man with an extravagant mustache sketches the scene in a leather-bound notebook. Don't know it yet, but that man is Ambrose Featherstone, the first and only person to publish a full monograph on the sport. The Motion of Shells, an inquiry into the velocity of the terrestrial tortoise. It includes several poorly drawn diagrams and a bold thesis that tortoises move faster when ignored. Historians still argue whether Featherstone was serious, or simply very bored in the countryside, and maybe that's the heart of it all. Victorian England, despite its clamour and coal smoke and imperial machinery, had pockets of unhurried absurdity. This sport, if you can even call it, that existed in the margins, in the back gardens, in shaded conservatories and afternoon teas, it never took centre stage, but perhaps that was its charm. No medals, no trophies, just stories, like the tale of the great escapist, a tortoise named Percival who, in 1873, vanished mid-race and was found 2 days later inside the clergyman's vegetable patch, or Daisy, who once stopped entirely for over an hour, only to relative term across the finish line in a frenzy after someone accidentally dropped a slice of cucumber nearby. You smile again, because these aren't just animals, they're characters, and somehow their personalities have been woven into the collective fabric of this odd, slow, entirely lovable pastime. You brush a bit of grass from your sleeve and stand, wandering, through the garden as twilight begins to fold itself gently over the hedges. Somewhere, a woman is knitting a tiny velvet blanket for her champion racer. 2 boys argue over whether carrots or strawberries produce better results. A portly gentleman takes exaggerated notes beside a very still tortoise and mutters, "Ah, yes." Strategic pause, and you soak it in, all of it, because you're realizing something. This isn't a sport about speed at all. It's about attention, care, a kind of reverence for the minute, the meandering, the things most people rush past. The Victorian tortoise craze may have been fleeting, but it spoke to something timeless, something quiet and content in moving at a pace just slightly slower than the world around you. You kneel beside a racer, now its name scratched lightly on its shell in chalk, Florence. She looks up at you slowly, blinks once, and resumes her nearly imperceptible crawl. The crowd applauds. You do too. You stay seated on the edge of the lawn, dappled with the long shadows of twilight and the warm afterglow of a cucumber-fed champion's glory. The crowd has thinned now, replaced by clusters of neighbors lingering by wicker baskets and cooling teapots. A phonograph whirs softly in the distance, attempting to play Chopin, but warbling like a seasick nightingale. Your eyes drift to a pamphlet that flutters from someone's pocket and lands face up beside you. The Colonian Weekly News and Observations for the discerning tortoise enthusiast. Yes, of course there was a newsletter, and you're not surprised in the slightest to learn that, during the height of the craze, entire columns were dedicated to racer performance charts, breeding tips, etiquette for handling your tortoise in mixed company, and a recurring feature titled Shell of the Week. You leaf through the imagined pages, and it's all there. Sketches of unusually patterned shells, lively debates over the best type of enclosure for post-race rest, and an opinion piece called on the ethics of tortoise footwear. Historians still argue whether the tiny leather boots referenced in that editorial ever actually existed, or whether the author was simply being cheeky. But the world of Victorian tortoise racing wasn't just an eccentric local fad. It was a social mirror, subtly reflecting the quirks, anxieties, and ambitions of an empire in miniature. You follow the trail back to the drawing rooms and parlors of the middle and upper classes. Here, beneath chandelier light and the ticking of mantel clocks, tortoises became more than pets. They were conversation pieces. Lady Thistlewick, for instance, was known to host shell suppers, lavish affairs where guests would dine on cold aspic and lemon syllabub while placing bets on miniature indoor racers. Along polished mahogany floors, tortoises were fitted with color-coded ribbons. One was said to wear a monocle. You step into one of those parlors now, trailing your fingers along wallpaper with a velvet flocked pattern. The room smells faintly of lavender and pipe tobacco. On the floor, for tortoises, meander through a narrow track marked by silver forks. Lords, ladies, and university dropouts lean forward eagerly. You hear murmurs. Come along, Sir Hobbles. 5 shillings, says Myrtle turns left. Again she always turns left. These gatherings were oddly democratic in their appeal. While most formal sports of the age belonged to the elite, polo, fencing, fox hunting, tortoise racing blurred the lines. It was slow enough for the elderly, quiet enough for children, and silly enough to make everyone laugh just a little too hard at a creature taking 30 minutes to cross a carpet. And then came the betting. Not the fierce, hard-drinking sort you'd find at the horse tracks, but something more quaint, more ceremonial. Bets were often modest sweets, homemade jam, knitting needles, or even a freshly ironed cravat. Yet in certain circles, things escalated. Whispered rumors told of a woman in Dorset who wagered her entire tea set on a tortoise named Clarence, only to lose it in what was later deemed a tragic Daisy-related distraction. You chuckle, imagining Clarence suddenly turning left to nibble a flower, the teacups already being packed into someone else's basket. The Victorian newspapers, always hungry for novelty, latched on. The Times ran a cartoon of a gentleman in full racing gear astride a tortoise, captioned, "The sport of tomorrow today, in slow motion." Several regional papers printed race results alongside cricket scores, though only when the races involved titled participants or particularly funny pet names. Viscount Nibblesworth, victorious in Yorkshire. As the craze reached its peak, so too did the sense of spectacle. Town fairs began including tortoise race events, with small grandstands, pennants, and prize ribbons. Vendors sold novelty items, tortoise-shaped sugar candies, embroidered shell cozies, even slow-motion flipbooks of races. You wander one such fairground now, weaving between stalls of baked apples, brass trinkets, and piles of hay. Children squeal as they place their bets, and their parents, feigning indifference, lean in just a bit too far to cheer for Shelley the bold. You pause at a table where an old man repairs miniature racing bibs. He tips his hat and explains, she can't race without her lucky number 4, refuses to move. He's joking, probably, but part of you isn't sure, because in this world, the lines between fantasy and earnest tradition blur in the most delightful ways. There's an art to caring about something absurd, and the Victorians' masters of ceremony perfected it. Tortoise racing was never really about the tortoises. It was about control, community, distraction, a slow-motion rebellion against an accelerating world. By the 1880s, the Industrial Revolution was thundering forward. Trains howled through the countryside, telegraphs clicked like nervous woodpeckers, and steamships shrank oceans. The world was moving faster, so naturally, the English gentry decided to watch tortoises instead. They built fences for them, bred them, named them after monarchs and vegetables, and constructed entire social lives around creatures who measured time in flower petals and soft earth. You take one last look at the racetrack, now well worn, gently trampled, and lined with fading chalk arrows. A tortoise lingers near the finish line, unmoved by the faint applause. Someone offers it a tomato. It blinks once, then again, and then, ever so slowly, it leans forward. Because victory is not speed, it is persistence, and in the world of Victorian tortoise racing, persistence was everything. You rise from the imaginary racetrack, brushing hay from your sleeves as the sun dips behind a bank of distant chimneys. The scent of roasted chestnuts and horse manure lingers in the air. A child scampers past, clutching a tiny tortoise figurine, carved from bone. Behind him, an elderly man debates with a vendor over whether Mildred the Marvel should be disqualified for unauthorized dandelion consumption. But tonight, we're not just lingering among the fairgoers and drawing rooms, we're slipping behind the scenes into the secret world of Victorian tortoise trainers. Yes, they existed, and no, they were not strictly speaking very good at their jobs. You enter a modest brick house with ivy climbing the pip's side and a crooked chimney that puffs like a dozing giant. Inside, a woman in her late 50s, spectacles, apron, hair like a tea kettle exploded, meticulously arranges lettuce leaves on a velvet-lined tray. This is Mrs. Norbury, an amateur tortoise trainer with grand aspirations. She speaks in hushed tones, as if afraid the tortoises might overhear. Her prized racer Horace is in the corner under a tiny knitted blanket labeled, "Do not disturb, big race, tomorrow." According to the dusty scrapbooks and household journals left behind, Mrs. Norbury wasn't alone. Across Britain, a small but enthusiastic subculture of tortoise coaches emerged. Each had their own theories, some borderline scientific, others charmingly absurd. Some swore by diet, dandelions for speed, watercress for stamina, and cucumber slices served at precisely room temperature to avoid digestive distraction. Others believed tortoises needed visual motivation, placing strawberries at the end of the track, or using small mirrors to reflect sunlight and spark a competitive instinct. One gentleman in Kent even claimed he had taught his tortoise to recognize applause. Historians still argue whether this was Pavlovian brilliance or wishful thinking. The tortoise in question, Sir Knuckles, was reported to have moved an entire 4 inches in response to a standing ovation, And then there were the training regimens. A certain Colonel Whitby, retired from service in India and thoroughly unoccupied, kept meticulous records of his Tortoise's daily conditioning walks. These consisted of placing the animal at one end of the rose garden and timing how long it took to reach the bird bath. Whitby swore that a rainy day added exactly 13 seconds per yard. He published his findings in the Hampshire Amateur Zoological Quarterly, which had precisely 7 subscribers. You peek inside his journal now. The handwriting is jagged with enthusiasm. Phrases like noticeable improvement, post-Mulberry breakfast, and suspect fatigue due to over-polishing of shell fill the margins. One section is underlined twice. Possible advantage in racing barefoot versus felt slippers, further trials required. And while no definitive tortoise training method emerged, this did little to dampen the enthusiasm. In fact, the lack of scientific rigor was part of the appeal. In a world increasingly obsessed with order, charts, and mechanization, here was a creature that obeyed no timetable but its own. Victorians adored categorizing things, but tortoises defied easy categorization. They were slow, mysterious, vaguely ancient, and to some borderline philosophical. You drift now to a tea salon in Bath, where 3 women of the Bloomsbury persuasion sit hunched over a tiny track chalked into the marble floor. They whisper things like, "Do you think they understand us?" He hesitated at the fork in the track. Perhaps he's a Libra. There's laughter, of course, gentle, tinkling laughter like a wind chime left in the rain. One woman claims she read a treatise comparing tortoise movement to the poetry of Keats. Another believes they are incarnations of great thinkers past Plato in a shell, inching toward enlightenment, and you're just enjoying the theatre of it all. Because whether it was training, philosophy, or gentle madness, the truth is that Victorians found meaning in the most unlikely creatures. Take the case of young Arnold Green, age 11, who wrote an entire children's book starring his pet tortoise as a time-traveling knight. The story involved duels, a jelly bean-powered saddle, and an extended detour through prehistoric swamps. His mother had the pages bound and presented it at the local fair. Arnold placed 3rd behind a girl who'd crocheted an anatomically accurate liver. You smile, imagining little Arnold reading his story aloud to Horatio, the tortoise in question, who reportedly listened intently for a solid 20 minutes before climbing into a sock drawer. The Victorians, for all their rigid manners and corseted spines, knew how to indulge a bit of whimsy in an era when trains roared, telegrams buzzed, and London was perpetually shrouded in soot and stress. The act of patiently watching a tortoise coaxing it, training it, celebrating its most incremental triumphs, became a quiet rebellion, a refusal to be hurried, a soft chuckle in the face of empire. You watch Mrs. Norbury now, whispering encouragements as Horace takes his evening stroll across a shallow tray of sand. She marks his progress with pins, offers a tiny bow of respect when he turns left, and finally, gently, places him beneath his embroidered blanket. The lamp is dimmed. The room is quiet. Horace has trained. The race is tomorrow, and whether he wins or simply naps halfway through, he will be cheered just the same. You sit back as the dawn light filters softly through a lace-curtained window, casting delicate patterns on the wooden floorboards. Outside, the world is waking horses, clip-clopping down cobbled streets, shopkeepers opening their shutters, and the scent of freshly baked bread mingling with the faint aroma of coal smoke. The big day has arrived, the tortoise races. You find yourself back at the village green, now transformed into a bustling event space. Bunting flutters in the gentle breeze, and the air hums with quiet excitement. Ladies in lace gloves and men in waistcoats cluster around the makeshift track, their breath visible in the cool morning air. The tortoises are lined up, each sporting a tiny painted number tied carefully around their shells with silk ribbons. The crowd murmurs softly as the starter, a solemn gentleman with a stopwatch, raises his hand. You glance at the track itself. It's a simple oval, about 10 feet long, marked by wooden stakes and low ropes. The grass has been trimmed short and brushed smooth. You notice some competitors have been given miniature shade umbrellas, apparently to keep them cool under the spring sun. The starter's hand falls. The tortoises begin their slow march. You feel the strange thrill of watching something so quietly determined. The pace is glacial, of course. Minutes pass, and only the most attentive spectator notices a slight nudge forward by Myrtle the bold, her front left leg stretching out a fraction more than usual. Nearby, a child claps softly, eyes wide. You reflect on how tortoise racing, at its heart, is less about competition and more about community, chance for neighbors to gather, share stories, and celebrate small moments of joy. It's a shared ritual of patience and good humor. In fact, many locals would wager not on who finished first, since finish times were often impossible to predict, but on the quirks and personalities of the tortoises themselves. Bets were placed on which would take the longest snack break, who might suddenly turn and head in the wrong direction, or which one seemed most likely to take a nap mid-race. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on personality over speed was a subtle critique of Victorian obsession with progress, or simply a charming byproduct of the sport's leisurely pace. You watch as Sir Knuckles unexpectedly stops halfway, his head tilting slightly as if pondering the meaning of life for perhaps just a passing leaf. Beside you, a gentleman chuckles that one always does that. He's the philosopher of the bunch. As the race drags on, the crowd's attention drifts toward other pleasures. Tea and cucumber sandwiches served on delicate china, the soft notes of a violinist playing a sleepy tune, and the gentle rustle of pages as someone reads aloud a poem about slow rivers and shaded woods. You realize the races are as much about the ambience and companionship as about the tortoises themselves. Later, prizes are awarded not just for winning, but for best shell pattern, most reliable pace, and even most likely to stop and smell the flowers. You overhear a conversation about the decorative traditions of tortoise adornments. Some owners painted tiny floral motifs on their shells, while others fashioned miniature capes from silk scraps. One quirky anecdote involves a tortoise named Duchess, who reputedly wore a pearl necklace during races, causing quite a stir among the spectators. The event concludes with gentle applause and promises of next year's race. Tortoises are carefully gathered, ribbons removed, and blankets wrapped. The green returns to its quiet self as you leave. You carry with you the lingering sense of a slower world, one where patience is celebrated, and even the smallest movement is cause for quiet cheer. You stroll away from the cheering crowd, the grass still damp beneath your feet, and the warmth of the spring sun gradually coaxing the chill from your skin. Your thoughts drift to the curious social side of tortoise racing, how this gentle pastime became a window into Victorian society itself. You might think such a slow-moving hobby would be a bit dull, but in reality, it was a subtle stage for all kinds of social rituals. The races brought together folks from varying walks of life, farmers, shopkeepers, aristocrats, and children, each with their own stake in the event. It was less about fierce rivalry and more about a shared culture of whimsy and gentle competition. In fact, many races became elaborate social occasions, complete with picnics, afternoon teas, and quiet debates about which tortoise had the best pedigree. Pedigrees, yes, believe it or not, tortoise lineage mattered to some owners, who maintained records of champion shells as meticulously as horse breeders logged thoroughbreds. You follow the trail to a particular club founded in London in 1873, the Tortoise Enthusiasts Society. This little group met regularly to exchange advice, share race results, and occasionally argue over the best diet to maximize a tortoise's race potential. Their newsletters were filled with poetic descriptions of shell patterns and the subtle art of training. One amusing detail: the society once tried to standardize race distances and rules, but the tortoises had other ideas. Some would suddenly veer off the track for hours, indulging in a leisurely exploration of the garden borders or napping beneath leaves. The society's attempts at discipline often failed, leaving members to shrug and chuckle at their unpredictability. Historians still debate whether this resistance to rigid rules reflected a deeper Victorian ambivalence toward industrial progression, embrace of nature's slow, deliberate pace amid a rapidly mechanizing world. You pause to imagine a typical meeting: ladies in high collars sipping chamomile tea, gentlemen in waistcoats quietly exchanging tips on shell polishing techniques, and a gentleman possibly wearing a tortoise-shaped lapel pin, listening intently as debates unfold about the merits of buttercup versus clover as race fuel. The tortoise, in this way, became a symbol of gentle defiance against the relentless tick of the clock, a living reminder that not all progress needed to be rushed. As you walk through the quiet streets now, you catch the faint sound of a grandfather clock striking 3, its chimes echoing softly through the mist. You wonder how many tortoise trainers might have paused to listen, their minds wandering to their slow-footed companions somewhere in the shade. And if you ever find yourself struggling with the endless rush of modern life, perhaps there's a lesson here. Sometimes it's perfectly fine to slow down, enjoy a cucumber slice, and watch the world move at tortoise speed. You find yourself back inside a cozy Victorian parlor, the fire crackling softly in the hearth as the evening light fades behind heavy drapes. The scent of lavender and old books hangs in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of pipe tobacco from a well-worn armchair. This is a world where tortoise racing wasn't just a hobby, it was a lifestyle, woven into the fabric of everyday existence. Tonight, you dive into the peculiar culture of tortoise racing's accessories and accoutrements, the tiny, oft-overlooked details that added charm and character to the sport. First, the racing tracks themselves. These were no mere dirt paths. Many enthusiasts went to great lengths to create elaborate courses, complete with miniature obstacles, ramps, and even tiny hedges fashioned from trimmed boxwood. Some tracks were indoors, set on drawing-room carpets lined with chalk or string to mark lanes, while others sprawled across garden lawns. You learn that certain tracks were said to bring good luck. A bend in the path here, a pebble placed just so there, each detail whispered about in hushed tones among the faithful. Some believed that the sound of a distant clock tower ticking near the track helped pacify anxious tortoises. Next come the trophies and prizes. Unlike modern medals or ribbons, many awards were whimsical and uniquely Victorian. One popular prize was a silver-plated lettuce fork, engraved with the winner's name and the year. Another was a handcrafted porcelain tortoise figurine, sometimes painted with the likeness of the champion itself. One amusing custom involved shell decorating before the race, which was generally frowned upon but secretly practiced by many. Owners painted intricate floral designs or heraldic patterns on their tortoise's shell using natural dyes made from crushed berries and flowers. There were whispers that a particularly dashing shell could distract competitors, least charm the crowd. Historians still argue whether these decorations were purely aesthetic or if they subtly influenced the tortoise's behavior. Some even speculated that certain colors might stimulate speed, though no scientific evidence supported this claim. Of course, no tortoise race was complete without the essential refreshments for both spectators and racers. Victorian snack tables were laden with delicate cakes, fresh fruits, and an assortment of teas often served from fine china adorned with tortoise motifs. This culinary homage shows just how beloved these creatures were, inspiring not only sports but art and cuisine. You chuckle softly, recalling a peculiar anecdote about a tortoise-themed jelly mold served at a charity luncheon in Brighton, which apparently resembled a turtle so closely that a few guests took a moment to realize it was edible. As your eyes grow heavy, you consider the legacy of these small details, the way a simple race became a tapestry of social gatherings, artistic expression, and gentle competition. It's a reminder that sometimes the most enduring stories are found in the smallest, slowest things. The gentle ticking of the grandfather clock accompanies your thoughts as you move from the ornate parlor to the quieter corners of Victorian England, where tortoise racing took on a surprisingly practical role. Tonight, you explore the unexpected uses of tortoises beyond their leisurely competitions. It may seem odd to think of tortoises as anything but slow-moving pets or racing curiosities, but Victorian households and rural communities sometimes employed them for peculiar purposes. One such use was as natural lawn mowers, albeit very slow ones. Gardens that prized immaculate grass found tortoises helpful in nibbling down tender shoots. Much like a tiny, armored gardener, you smile imagining a tortoise painstakingly wandering a rose garden, trimming grass blades with gentle bites, perhaps unaware of the stately surroundings. Another lesser-known role involved the use of tortoises in medicinal remedies, a practice inherited from much older traditions. Though the Victorians were famed for their scientific advancements, folk medicine persisted in pockets of the countryside. Some believed that powdered tortoise shells, when prepared carefully, could be used in salves for joint pain or as a mild tonic. Historians still debate whether these remedies had any efficacy or were more symbolic, a comforting ritual blending nature and nurture. Certainly, by the late 19th century, scientific medicine was moving fast, but the allure of ancient wisdom persisted. On a lighter note, you learn that tortoises were occasionally featured in Victorian children's education, not just as pets, but as living clocks. Because of their slow but steady pace, some educators used them to illustrate concepts of patience, time, and natural rhythms. In fact, some schools held miniature tortoise time trials as calming exercises. Imagine a room full of children, quietly watching as a tortoise made its slow progress across a desk, learning to appreciate the slow passage of moments rather than rushing through lessons. A quirky fringe detail emerges in your mind. Rumors that certain tortoise owners trained their pets to respond to soft whistles or gentle taps, turning them into surprisingly obedient creatures despite their leisurely nature. Whether true or folklore, the idea adds a layer of endearing mystique to these humble animals. And of course, you recall the familiar debate among scholars. Was the popularity of tortoise racing and its associated practices a quiet Victorian rebellion, against the accelerating pace of industrial life, or simply a quaint hobby to pass the time. You lean back, feeling the soft warmth of the hearth as your thoughts slow to match the pace of the tortoises themselves. There is something undeniably soothing about these creatures and their gentle presence, a quiet reminder to embrace patience in a world that never stops moving. You find yourself wandering the quieter lanes of Victorian England once more, this time tracing the stories of some of the notable characters who championed the tortoise racing craze. Unlike the usual sporting heroes, these aficionados often led surprisingly humble lives, yet their passion for tortoises left a small, lasting mark on their communities. Take, for instance, Mrs. Penelope Cratchit, a widowed seamstress known in her village for her exquisite lacework and her tortoise, Old Harold. Mrs. Cratchit wasn't the fastest or the most competitive racer, but she was beloved for her kindness and her habit of hosting post-race tea parties that felt more like family reunions. Her story reminds you how these events weren't just about speed, they were about connection. Then there was Mr. Jasper Finch, a retired naval officer who introduced tortoise racing to his seaside town. He was fascinated by exotic species brought back from colonial expeditions, carefully acclimated tortoises from far-flung regions to English gardens. His collection included some peculiar varieties, including the oddly named saddleback tortoise, which sported a pronounced hump on its shell. You chuckle softly, imagining Mr. Finch's tortoises lined up on the lawn, each with a miniature naval hat perched atop its shell, a detail that historians still argue over as either a charming eccentricity or a distraction tactic. You reflect on how these individuals and their stories add texture to the overall narrative, reminding you that behind every slow race lies a community rich with personality and quirks. It wasn't just the tortoises who had character. Their owners did too. You overhear conversations at local pubs, where race results are discussed alongside gossip and poetry. You picture rowdy laughter mingling with the clink of teacups during afternoon gatherings, where debates over the best shell pattern quickly dissolve into friendly wagers on who might next host the grandest race. One particularly endearing tale tells of a young apprentice named Thomas, who reportedly taught his tortoise to race by tapping a small bell. Though the tortoise's speed never improved much, Thomas' dedication made him a beloved figure in town lore. Reminder that passion often matters more than victory. Historians still debate whether such stories reflect genuine training techniques or are simply charming inventions of oral tradition, but they continue to color the rich tapestry of Victorian tortoise culture as you listen to these whispers of the past. The slow rhythm of the tortoise races feels less like a quaint pastime and more like a gentle pulse running through a slower, softer era, one where the smallest stories hold the greatest warmth. You drift alongside the slow-moving tortoises into the quieter, less charted territories of Victorian England, the countryside estates, small villages, and secret garden nooks, where tortoise racing quietly flourished away from the city bustle. Here, the pastime took on a different hue, one steeped in local traditions and customs. Unlike the publicized races in town squares or social clubs, many of these rural contests were intimate affairs, often part of larger seasonal festivals. You imagine harvest gatherings where families brought their tortoises out from cozy wooden boxes, settling them gently on soft grass sprinkled with wildflowers. The races blended seamlessly with music, storytelling, and the smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. One curious detail is the involvement of children, who treated their tortoise companions not only as racers but as lifelong friends. These young trainers crafted tiny homes for their pets, out of old cigar boxes and painted them in bright colors, believing that a happy tortoise was a faster tortoise. The care and attention given to these creatures were remarkable, almost parental. You note that some villages held tortoise parades before the races, where owners decorated their tortoises with ribbons, tiny hats, or even miniature scarves, knitted by grandmothers. The parades were slow-moving spectacles of pride and joy, showcasing the beauty of each tortoise's shell and personality. Historians still debate whether these rural tortoises events served as subtle resistance to urbanization, preserving slower nature-centric ways of life amid the sweeping changes of the Industrial Revolution. Some suggest they were nostalgic holdovers, while others see them as living celebrations of community bonds. You think about how this slow, deliberate racing culture offered comfort and continuity. In a world racing forwards, smokestacks belching, factories churning, these gentle events provided breathing space, a time to watch something slow and steady, to feel the reassuring pulse of nature's pace as twilight deepens. You picture families gathered around lanterns, whispering stories about their tortoise champions while the stars blink softly above. The world outside might be noisy and fast, but here, in these quiet pockets, time itself seemed to slow. The soft rustle of evening leaves guides you as you follow the path of tortoise racing beyond England's borders, tracing how this peculiar pastime rippled through the wider Victorian world. You find yourself imagining port cities and distant colonies where tortoise races carried a different meaning, in places like British India and the Caribbean. Tortoise racing blended Victorian traditions with local customs, creating unique, hybrid versions of the sport. You picture a bustling colonial marketplace, vibrant with colourful fabrics and the scent of spices, where tortoises are gently placed on hand-woven mats instead of manicured lawns. In some regions, tortoise racing was tied to festive rituals or seasonal celebrations. For example, in parts of the Caribbean, the races coincided with harvest festivals, mixing European leisure with indigenous rhythms and dances. The tortoise, already a symbol of endurance in many cultures, took on new layers of meaning. One delightful anecdote reveals how local children in India would sometimes race tortoises on the roofs of bungalows, making use of the cool, flat tiles as natural tracks. It's said that some of these rooftop races inspired playful bets and local legends. Much like their English cousins, historians still debate whether the export of tortoise racing helped spread Victorian values of patience and gentility, or if it simply became another canvas for cultural exchange and adaptation. There's also discussion about the environmental impacts, as tortoise species from different continents were moved around, sometimes causing unintentional ecological effects. You also learn of Victorian explorers and naturalists who documented tortoise species during their travels, often bringing home exotic specimens that fueled the racing craze back in England. Their journals described tortoises with striking shell patterns and curious behaviors that fascinated collectors. A fringe tidbit emerges. Some races in colonial settings included mixed species heats, where local tortoises raced against imported ones, leading to unpredictable outcomes. Imagine the surprise when a smaller, quicker native tortoise outpaced a bulkier foreign competitor as you absorb these stories. The global journey of tortoise racing reveals itself as a subtle thread weaving together disparate peoples and places slowly, gently, across vast distances. You settle into the comfortable rhythm of the tale, your breathing matching the unhurried pace of the tortoise, and the world outside fades into the soothing quiet of the night. Section 14. The sun hangs low in the late afternoon sky, casting a warm amber glow over a quaint village green nestled somewhere in the English countryside. It's the kind of place where time itself seems to sigh and slow down. You find yourself wandering through this serene setting, where the modern echoes of a centuries-old pastime softly stir the air. Tortoise racing, that slow and steady Victorian craze, making a gentle comeback in the most unexpected ways. You probably wouldn't expect to find tortoise racing on the agenda at today's village fetes, with their modern music stalls and buzzing fairground rides. Yet there it is, nestled quietly among the bunting and tea tents, a tiny track marked out with delicate chalk lines and the occasional sprig of wildflowers. The tortoises themselves, patient, ponderous, and perfectly unhurried, are the true stars of this soft spectacle. It's an enchanting sight, the way people of all ages gather around to watch the slow crawl of these shelled racers, their expressions ranging from affectionate amusement to genuine fascination. Children clutch homemade banners, shouting encouragement in whispers and giggles, while older villagers share nostalgic smiles, remembering when tortoise races were the highlight of social gatherings long ago. You can almost hear the gentle murmurs of the past, like an old record spinning softly in the background. At first glance, these modern races seem like nothing more than quaint nostalgia, a whimsical nod to a bygone era. But as you watch, you realize there's something quietly profound about this revival. It's not about the thrill of speed or the sharp crack of a starting pistol. No, these races embody something far more soothing, an embrace of patience, community, and the beauty of slow, deliberate movement. This modern resurgence is often centered around village fetes, garden parties, and small local festivals that cherish tradition and simplicity in an increasingly frenetic world. Picture the scene: a gentle summer breeze ruffling the leaves of ancient oak trees, the hum of bees mingling with the soft clatter of cups at a tea tent. And in the midst of it all, the tortoise track becomes a stage for a very different kind of competition, one where speed is relative, and the joy lies in the journey itself. You notice that the tortoise owners take great care with their little athletes. They bring cozy baskets lined with soft cloth, shaded from the sun, and feed them tender leaves picked fresh from their gardens. Some even knit tiny scarves or sew miniature hats for their pets, adding a splash of color and whimsy to the slow races. There's an undeniable charm in the way these gentle creatures are celebrated, their personalities cherished as much as their plodding prowess. One such event, you imagine, is the Slow and Steady Festival, held annually in a picturesque Cotswold town that seems to have stepped straight out of a storybook. This weekend-long festival features more than just tortoise races. There are poetry readings beneath the shade of sprawling chestnut trees, vintage tea parties where guests sip Earl Grey from delicate china cups, and workshops where locals try their hand at traditional crafts like lace-making and willow weaving. At the heart of it all, the tortoise races are the gentle heartbeat. Families come together, neighbors share stories, and the pace of life slows to match the deliberate steps of the tortoises. The festival's organizers describe the event as a celebration of Victorian values, patience, gentility, and an appreciation for nature's rhythms, but repackaged for a modern audience seeking calm in a noisy, fast-paced world. Historians and cultural commentators have taken an interest in these revivals, sparking debates about their significance. Some argue that the modern tortoise races are little more than nostalgic play, charming throwbacks that allow people to momentarily escape the relentless pace of contemporary life. Others believe these events serve a deeper cultural function, acting as peaceful protests against the stresses of modernity and offering a tangible connection to slower, more mindful ways of living. You can almost hear the scholars debating in cozy libraries and quiet cafes. Is this just innocent fun, or a subtle reclaiming of time itself? They point to the fact that in an era dominated by instant gratification and digital overwhelm, the deliberate, unhurried pace of tortoise racing provides a rare and precious counterpoint. One delightful anecdote from a recent festival adds a light-hearted touch. A tortoise named Flash, an ironically speedy name for such a slow creature, became something of a local celebrity after narrowly winning 3 consecutive races. Flash's unexpected streak of victories sparked good-natured betting among spectators and earned the tortoise a homemade trophy fashioned from twigs and ribbon. The name Flash alone became a running joke throughout the village, symbolizing the charming contradiction at the heart of tortoise racing, the celebration of slow progress in a world obsessed with speed. You can almost picture the villagers chuckling as they cheer on their favorite shelled racers, knowing that the real prize is the joy of watching something move at its own gentle pace. These festivals, while small and humble compared to grand sporting events, carry a warmth and intimacy that's hard to find elsewhere. The tortoise races invite spectators to pause, to watch carefully, and to appreciate the little things, how a tortoise's foot lifts and places itself with care, how the sunlight glints off a polished shell, how a crowd holds its breath as 2 racers inch closer together. You imagine a child's wide eyes as they witness the slow-motion drama unfold, perhaps learning for the first time that not all competition needs to be fierce or frantic. The lesson is clear. Sometimes slow and steady truly does win the day, and sometimes it's just enough to enjoy the steady rhythm of life. Of course, the tortoise racing revivals are not without their critics. Some dismiss these events as quaint affectations, relics of a past that has no place in modern society. There are whispered concerns about animal welfare, with debates about whether racing is appropriate for such slow-moving creatures. Organizers take these concerns seriously, emphasizing the gentle, stress-free nature of the races, where the tortoises are never rushed or forced. Historians still debate the origins of these revivals, questioning whether they are organic continuations of Victorian traditions or carefully curated heritage events designed to attract tourism and preserve local identity. Some point to the broader slow movement that has gained momentum in recent years, linking tortoise racing to trends like slow food and mindfulness. You reflect on how these modern echoes of tortoise racing connect the past and present in subtle, soothing ways. The Victorian craze may have faded from widespread popularity, but its spirit endures, carried forward by communities that value patience, connection, and the simple pleasure of watching a tortoise make its steady way across the grass. Beyond Britain, similar gentle revivals flicker in pockets around the world. Small groups of enthusiasts organize informal races, sharing tips on tortoise care and celebrating their favorite species. Online forums buzz with stories and photos, creating a virtual community bound by a shared love of these slow-moving companions. You consider how the tortoise, with its unhurried gait and ancient lineage, has become a symbol for something many of us crave: a reminder to slow down, to breathe deeply, and to appreciate the journey rather than just the destination. As you settle deeper into this thought, the evening shadows lengthen and the gentle sounds of the festival fade into a soft hush. The tortoises continue their slow crawl, unconcerned with the passage of time. moving steadily toward some unseen goal. Your own breath matches their pace, deep and even, as you drift toward the comforting quiet of night. The world outside may spin faster and louder, but here, with these gentle creatures and their quiet races, time flows with a softer, more soothing rhythm, and in that rhythm you find a gentle invitation to slow down, to savor the moment, and, perhaps, to carry a bit of the tortoise's patient spirit with you as you slip toward sleep. You are the tortoise now, inching slowly across the soft grass of a Victorian garden under a silver wash of moonlight. There's no rush here, only the calm, steady rhythm of your steps and the gentle night sounds wrapping around you like a soft blanket. You feel the cool dampness of the earth beneath your shell, the faint scent of blooming night jasmine drifting on the breeze, and the quiet hum of the world settling into sleep. This garden, once the stage for lively races and bustling gatherings, now holds a serene stillness. The echoes of excited cheers and whispered wagers have faded into memory, leaving behind only the steady pulse of time measured in slow, deliberate moments. It's as if the tortoises themselves have become keepers of this unhurried pace, guardians of patience in a world that often forgets how to wait. You recall the many faces and places from this journey: Mrs. Cratchit's tea parties, Mr. Finch's naval hats, the bustling colonial markets, and the quiet village, fates all now blending into the soft shadows cast by the moon. The tortoise races weren't just about competition, they were about connection, community, and the simple joy of watching something slow and steady persist against the rush. Historians still debate the true impact of this Victorian pastime, whether it was a fleeting eccentricity or a meaningful cultural thread, but here, in the hush of night, such questions dissolve. What remains is the comfort of slow movement, the gentle assurance that even the smallest creatures leave a lasting trace. As you continue your quiet journey across the lawn, you feel a deep peace settling over you. No finish line, no crowd, just the steady, soothing progress of time itself, carrying you gently forward.